When retired veterinary technician Mark Reynolds stepped out onto his porch that crisp autumn morning, he was expecting nothing more exciting than the usual hum of forest life. A few songbirds, maybe a curious deer at the edge of the clearing. Instead, he found a tiny bundle of spotted fur half hidden under his wood pile. The creature was shivering, eyes crusted nearly shut, breathing shallow and strained. Mark's heart clenched. Even after 35 years, patching up animals, sights like this still hit him in the gut. "Oh, you poor little thing," he murmured, crouching carefully. A young bobcat, judging by the size, maybe 8 weeks old, alone, half starved, with no sign of a mother anywhere. Mark moved slowly, letting his scent drift so he wouldn't startle the kitten into bolting. Not that it looked like it could run. When he extended his hand, the kitten made a pitiful rasp of a growl, then collapsed back on its side, exhausted. Mark scooped it up gently, cradling it against his chest. Its body was frighteningly light, ribs sharp under its patchy fur. "You're coming inside with me, little fella." Inside the cozy cabin, Mark set to work like it was second nature, warming blankets in the dryer, mixing up a formula that would be easy on a starved stomach, prepping a tiny catheter in case hydration didn't take by mouth. His hands remembered every step. The bobcat, who he started calling Pika for no reason except the name, popped into his head, accepted the warm milk weekly at first, then with surprising greed. Within hours, Pika was nestled in a towel-lined basket by the fireplace, his tiny sides rising and falling in steadier rhythm. Mark didn't kid himself. Wild animals weren't meant to live with people. As soon as Pa was stronger, he'd call the state wildlife folks and find a proper rehabber. But that decision seemed to slip further into the future with each passing day. Pika followed Mark everywhere on wobbly kitten legs. At night, the bobcat would drag himself up onto Mark's bed and sprawl across his legs like a living, heated blanket. The first time it happened, Mark woke up startled, feeling sharp claws flex and retract gently against his shin. Then he heard the low, oddly musical purr vibrating through the blanket. "All right, buddy," he sighed, reaching down to scratch behind one oversized ear. "You can stay." It wasn't long before Mark's 3 old buddies started showing up for their usual Saturday gatherings. Joe, Rick, and Sam had been coming over once a week for years, drinking a few beers, swapping stories from the old days, giving Mark grief about how quiet his retirement was. The first Saturday after Pika's arrival, Mark warned them, "Now, don't be startled, boys. I've got a house guest, little bobcat kitten." Joe laughed. "Mark, only you would adopt something with fangs sharper than yours." But when they walked in and saw Pika sitting bolt upright on the rug, staring at them with huge amber eyes, all 3 men froze. Rick gave a low whistle. "That's not exactly little. He's growing fast," Mark admitted. Pika made a curious cheering sound, his tail lashing in slow arcs. Sam tried to move closer, and the bobcat let out a sound that was halfway between a growl and a weird strangled syllable. "Did he just say new?" Joe asked, eyes wide. Mark burst out laughing. "He's trying to imitate human noises. I think he does that all the time." Sits there watching me mouth words, then makes these hilarious attempts. Sure enough, Pika kept issuing these squeaky warbled sounds that, almost, if you squinted your ears, sounded like he was trying to talk. The more relaxed the group got, the braver Pika became. He walked right up to Joe, sniffed his boots, then looked up at him, and tried a horse. Huru, the men stared. Good God, Mark, Rick said finally. You're raising a bobcat that wants to be a person. He's a character, Mark said proudly. Hasn't tried to eat me yet. As the weeks rolled on, Pika's fascination with human speech only grew. Mark would catch him sitting on the table, staring intently whenever Mark was on the phone. Sometimes he'd even try to mimic Mark's laugh, producing this raspy chuff that sounded so earnest. Mark would nearly fall over, chuckling. One evening, Mark was talking to his daughter on speaker, explaining how the roof needed new shingles. Suddenly, Pika bounced up, pressed his face right to the phone, and let out a loud R.A. On the other end, his daughter paused. Dad, was that you? Nope, that's your little brother here trying to contribute to the conversation. Oh my God, you're turning into one of those weird old men with a talking pet. Mark grinned. Best retirement I could have hoped for. But Pika didn't just try to talk. He developed opinions, strong ones, especially about Mark's three friends. Joe, Rick, and Sam had learned to approach slowly with hands visible like they were visiting a suspicious neighbor. The moment anyone raised their voice, like when Rick got heated telling an old hunting story, Purr would scuttle over and butt between Mark and the offender, making indignant broken syllables that sounded suspiciously like, you going to translate that for us, Mark? Joe asked one day, carefully offering Pika a piece of jerky. Mark snorted. Roughly means, what your tone around my old man? Saturday afternoons became a highlight of Pika's week. He'd hover nearby, glaring at the men if they laughed too loud or clinked bottles too sharply. Once he even tried to mimic their laughter, letting out a wheezy ha that was so startling the whole group fell silent, then burst into howls of mirth. Congratulations, Sam said, wiping tears from his eyes. Your bobcat thinks he's one of us. Mark couldn't deny the joy it brought him. Living alone had its quiet perks, but it also meant long stretches with no voices but his own. Having Pika there, trying to hold conversations in his weird, choppy bobcat speech made the house feel more alive than it had in years. One rainy evening, Mark was dozing in his chair when Parr hopped up onto the armrest. The bobcat studied Mark's face closely, then opened his mouth and produced something that sounded suspiciously like Mark. Mark jolted awake so fast he nearly flipped the chair. You did not just. Pika looked smug, licked his chops, then flopped across Mark's lap and started to purr. Mark ran a hand over the thick, spotted fur, chuckling. All right, I'm losing my mind. But if I have to go crazy, I'm glad it's with you. It wasn't always comedy, though. One afternoon, while Mark was stacking firewood, he lost his footing on a slick patch and went down hard. The crack of bone was unmistakable. His ankle gave way like a twig. Mark sucked in a breath, pain blooming sharp and white. Before he could call for help, Pico appeared out of nowhere, pressing his body close, making rapid, distressed cheer-ups. Easy, boy, Mark grunted. Trying not to black out, Pika began pacing tight circles, then darted into the house. Moments later, Mark heard the heavy receiver of the landline crash to the floor. Pika had knocked it off the hook. The bobcat began batting at it, wildly, issuing a series of yowls that almost sounded like words. Mark could only lie there watching in awe. When Joe and the others showed up for their usual visit, they found Pika sitting by the door, meowing in frantic, garbled sounds, leading them straight to Mark. "That damn cat talked us into checking the porch," Rick said later, shaking his head. "Not sure how, but he's smarter than half the people I know." As Mark healed, Pika barely left his side. Whenever Mark tried to hobble to the bathroom, the bobcat planted himself against his good leg, making worried noises that might have been a scolding. At night, Pika would drape himself across Mark's chest and hum his broken little purr words, a lullaby only he could produce. Over time, the friends grew accustomed to Pika's antics. They'd greet him like another member of the club. "How's the old man treating you, Pika?" Joe would ask, and Pika would tip his head and give a soft gr as if offering an opinion on Mark's cooking skills. One spring afternoon, Rick arrived with a new phone that had a voice assistant feature. "Teach him to push this button and he'll call for help next time you break a leg." Mark laughed. But within a week, Pika had figured it out, sort of. Mostly, he'd slap the button and then wibble nonsense at the robotic voice until it shut off in confusion. But once or twice he managed a half-clear ma UK that sent Mark into helpless giggles. As the years rolled on, Pika grew heavier, his face broadening, shoulders filling out into the sleek, dangerous power of a mature bobcat. His paws grew thick and solid, claws like ivory scythes, and when he moved, there was a silent rippling grace that reminded Mark every day that his friend was still a wild creature at heart. Yet all that power seemed to melt away whenever Pika jumped up onto the windowsill, curling his tail neatly around his feet and watched the world beyond the glass with that same wide-eyed curiosity he'd had as a kitten. Sometimes a pair of deer would step into the clearing, or a hawk would wheel overhead, and Pika would turn his head slowly toward Mark, open his mouth, and let out a low, tangled string of garbled vowels. It was as if he were offering commentary on the visitors outside. Half gossip, half playful report. Mark always played along, nodding thoughtfully, answering in a calm voice, "Yeah, I saw them too. Big doe this time. Bet she's got a 4. Nearby." Pika would give a little huff, blink those golden eyes, and return to watching, completely content to sit there in this quiet conversation. Neither of them truly understood, yet both completely cherished their odd companionship deepened over countless such afternoons. In the evenings, Pika would lie across Mark's legs while he read, occasionally twisting around to push his head under Mark's hand, demanding screeches. More than once, Mark caught himself absently talking to the bobcat as if to an old friend, about the garden or how the neighbor's dog kept getting into the trash. Pika would answer with his peculiar, breathy syllables that wavered between a purr and a mumble, so intent that it felt like they were sharing secrets. Eventually even Joe, Rick, and Sam admitted that they came as much for Pika as for Mark. Their old Saturday gatherings changed. Now, before they'd crack a beer, they'd all greet the big bobcat first, offering cautious pats or scratches under his chin. Watching that big spotted cat try so earnestly to imitate human speech, or seeing him stand on his hind legs to press his broad paws into Mark's chest, making a low rattling sound that could almost have been Ma, was better entertainment than any TV show. "Never thought I'd be jealous of a bobcat," Joe said one evening, shaking his head as Pika leaned in, practically hugging Mark with his massive front legs. Mark just grinned, scratching behind the tufted ears. "Best conversationalist I've ever met." There was one afternoon when a sudden downpour trapped them all on the porch. Rain drummed on the roof, a steady, soothing roar. Pika paced from man to man, stopping to study each face, then returned to Mark's side and let out a long rolling string of nonsense sounds, half growl, half chant, before settling against Mark's hip with a contented "Aye." Joe laughed softly. "Reckon he's giving us a weather report." Another evening, Rick caught Pika perched on the porch railing, staring at the setting sun. When Rick spoke up, the bobcat actually turned and let out a warbled string of sounds as if to say, "I see it too." Rick stood there stunned, then gave a slow nod. "All right, big guy. Guess we're all watching it together." Over time, these moments wove themselves into the fabric of Mark's life. Long after his joints grew stiff and the hair at his temples turned white, he still woke to find Pika sprawled across his feet or perched by the window, offering his growly near words. Mark would chuckle, sip his coffee, and answer like always, glad beyond measure that he'd taken a chance on that frail kitten so many years before. And in the golden light of late afternoons, with laughter floating from the porch and a bobcat trying hilariously to sound like a person, Mark often thought he wouldn't trade this life for anything in the world. Because in the quiet between the trees and the attempts at human words, he'd found something profound. Proof that love needs no common language, only a willing heart to